into your bag on a wet morning, pull out the umbrella, and look at the word itself, umbrella. It comes from umbra, the Latin word for shade, shadow, not rain. That is a strange name for a thing you only ever touch when the sky opens up. But it is not a translation error, and it is not a coincidence. It is a fossil, sitting in plain sight in your own vocabulary, because for most of the last 4,000 years, this object had almost nothing to do with staying dry. It had everything to do with who was allowed to stand in the shade and who had to stand out in the sun holding it up. Picture this. A king walks through Nineveh in the 7th century before Christ, and above his head there is a canopy on a long pole. It is not there because the weather is bad. It is there because the weather is beautiful, and being untouched by beautiful weather is the whole point. Somewhere behind him, a man walks backward through the heat, arms raised, sweating, so the king does not have to. Your umbrella cost you maybe $7 at a drugstore counter. You will lose it. You have probably lost several already, and you did not go back for a single one of them. That casual little loss is the end of a story that runs through an emperor's carriage. 1,000 years of European silence, a whaling ship, a street fight in London, and a steel mill in Sheffield. Here is the strange part. The umbrella did not win when it became valuable. It won when it became worthless. So where did the shadow of a god end up rolling around in the footwell of your back seat? Start where the evidence starts, which is on walls. Ancient Egyptian art shows sunshades that would look almost primitive to you now. Palm leaves and feathers, and stretched papyrus, fastened to a long stick. They are held over the heads of pharaohs, over the heads of gods, over royal figures riding in chariots under an African sun. The technology is barely technology at all. A servant, a stick, and a leaf. Assyrian reliefs from roughly the same span of history show the same arrangement, and so does the art of ancient Persia, and so, later, does China. 4,000 years, 3 separate civilizations, and one shared idea that nobody seems to have needed to be taught. The idea is this: shade is not comfort, shade is rank. Think about what a tan actually meant for almost all of human history. Skin darkened by the sun was the mark of a person who worked outdoors, which meant a person who worked. Pale skin was proof of the opposite, so a portable patch of shadow was a portable statement, and everybody who saw it understood the statement instantly, in any language. Which is why the umbrella almost never appears in ancient art alone. It appears with a carrier attached. These early canopies were heavy and costly, and the people holding them up were servants, and often they were slaves. For some of them, this was not one duty among many. Holding shade above another person's head was the entire job, and it lasted as long as they did. Imagine that as a career. You are not building anything, or growing anything, or carrying anything useful. You exist so that another human being can be cooler than you are, in public, where everyone can see it. The symbolism ran so deep that it outlived every empire that invented it. In Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, the chhatra, the sacred parasol, is one of the 8 auspicious symbols, standing for royalty and divine protection, and deities are shown with one held above them. The Vatican still keeps a ceremonial umbrella in its heraldry to this day. In several Asian courts, the number of tiers on a ruler's umbrella was itself a measure of how much ruler you were dealing with. Nobody was thinking about rain. Rain was a peasant problem, and peasants got wet. So a question was already sitting there, waiting 4,000 years for somebody to be reckless enough to ask it. Who is allowed to touch the handle? Before we go any further, take a second and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and whether it happens to be raining there right now. Every comment gets read, and the map that builds up down there is always a surprise. Now, if the ancient world treated the umbrella as a status object rather than a rain object, you would expect somebody, somewhere, to eventually notice that a canopy on a stick is also extremely good at stopping water. Somebody did. Roughly 2,000 years ago, in China, Chinese craftsmen had been building parasols from silk and bamboo, which is elegant and expensive and completely useless in a storm. But then they started treating paper with wax and lacquer, and that changed the object entirely. The oiled paper umbrella could shed water. That is the first real rain umbrella in human history, and it arrives about 17 centuries before a London gentleman would get pelted with garbage for owning one. The engineering went further. The oldest written record of a collapsible umbrella dates to the year 21, when the ruler Wang Mang had one made for a ceremonial four-wheeled carriage. According to the account of Fu Qian, an official of the Three Kingdoms era, the thing worked on jointed arms, so it could extend and retract. Some researchers argue that folding umbrellas in China are considerably older still, pointing to relics found near Luoyang, though that claim sits on thinner ground and is best treated as an open question rather than a settled fact. Sit with the 21 date for a moment anyway. That is the same century as Roman emperors and Judean governors. And already, in China, there is a machine that opens and closes exactly the way the thing in your bag opens and closes. The Chinese character for umbrella still looks like a folding frame, because that is what it is drawing. But here is the part that should make your teeth itch. Solving the rain did not free the umbrella. It just gave status something new to hold on to. Imperial China color-coded the things. Red and yellow canopies belonged to the imperial family, and everyone else used what everyone else was permitted to use. Size did the rest of the talking. A bigger umbrella needed more carriers, and more carriers meant more power, so the object turned into a kind of walking rank badge that you could count from across a courtyard. The terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang, buried around 210 before Christ, comes with a canopy fitted to a chariot, because of course it does. Even in the afterlife, an emperor does not stand in his own weather. So the technology existed, waterproofing existed, folding existed, all of it existed while Rome was still standing. Which raises the obvious problem. Why did the Western world then spend another 1700 years walking around soaked? The answer is not about engineering at all. It is about a rule, and the rule was about men. The Greeks had the parasol, and the Romans had it too, but it landed in both places as a woman's object. A Greek woman, at a festival, with a skiadion over her head, was doing something ordinary and fashionable. A Roman woman at the amphitheater with a canopy was doing the same. By the 5th century before Christ, the parasol was simply part of what fashionable women carried, weather permitting or not. A man under one, though, was a joke. In Greece and Rome, the umbrella was considered effeminate, and men essentially did not use it. Not because it failed, because of what other men would say. Read that again, because it is the hinge of this entire story. The umbrella did not disappear from the West for lack of a good design. It disappeared because half the population was socially forbidden from touching it, and the other half only used it in the sun. Then Rome fell, and the object nearly evaporated. Records of umbrellas in medieval Europe are so scarce that historians largely conclude the thing was hardly used there at all. For roughly 1,000 years, a continent that gets rained on constantly simply did not carry umbrellas. So what did people do instead? They got wet, and they got clever about getting wet. Heavy wool cloaks that soaked through and stayed soaked. Wide-brimmed hats that funneled water down your back. Pattens, which were wooden platforms strapped under your shoes to lift you above the mud and the muck of a street that was, to be honest, not only mud. And if you were rich, you paid for the only real luxury available, which was a roof, a sedan chair, a coach, a canopy that somebody else was standing in the rain to operate for you. Notice what just happened. The shade rule quietly turned into the rain rule, and it kept the exact same shape. Getting wet was for people who could not afford to stay dry, and staying dry was something you purchased from another human being's discomfort. That was Europe in the 17th century. Now hold it next to the other side of the world, at the same moment. A man in Hangzhou steps out into a downpour, opens an oiled paper canopy, and walks to where he is going, dry, alone, owing nobody anything. A man in London steps out into the same downpour and is either soaked to the skin or negotiating a fare. Same planet, same rain, two completely different centuries of comfort. The umbrella did find its way back into Europe, drifting up through Italy and into France by the 16th and 17th centuries. But it came back into exactly the seat it had been sitting in for 4,000 years. A luxury, a woman's accessory at court, decorated, expensive, carried where it could be admired. Which is why what happened next in London was not a technological event. It was a fight. But before the fight, it is worth being honest about what this beautiful object was actually made of and who paid for it. Start with the carrier again, because he never really left. 4,000 years of the umbrella standing upright depended on somebody standing in the sun to hold it. That is the first cost, and it is paid in human beings. The second cost is the frame. European umbrellas were built from wood, from iron, and from whalebone. The ribs of the elegant thing a lady carried through a garden came out of an animal killed at sea by men in an open boat, and the whaling industry behind that supply chain was one of the most brutal trades on earth. The umbrella was, briefly, a whaling product with lace on it, and these things were monsters. An early umbrella was not a light accessory you forget in a restaurant. The ribs were straight, hinged, and heavy, hung on a stout wooden handle. You did not carry it so much as march with it. The graceful curved shape you know did not exist yet, and would not for a long time. Which brings us to a merchant named Jonas Hanway. Hanway was born in Portsmouth in 1712, and he had the sort of life that would be a whole video on its own. He apprenticed to a merchant in Lisbon, partnered into a trading house in St. Petersburg, and in 1743 travelled overland from Russia into Persia with a caravan of woolen goods, surviving shipwreck and hostility along the way. He came home to London a well-travelled, well-respected man, and he founded the Marine Society, and he campaigned for the child chimney sweeps, and he famously hated tea so much that he picked a public fight with Samuel Johnson about it, and lost. None of that is why anyone remembers him. He is remembered because in the early 1750s, Jonas Hanway started walking around London in the rain under an umbrella, and the city lost its mind. People stared. People hooted at him in the street. People jeered. Contemporary accounts have him pelted with rubbish, more than once, by strangers who had never met him and who were genuinely, sincerely offended by a man choosing to be dry. But the worst of it did not come from random bystanders. It came from the hackney coachman and the sedan chairman, and their hostility was not fashion policing. It was economics, and it was rational. Think it through the way they did. Rain was payday. On a wet afternoon, a coach with a little canopy was the only dry route across London, and every man caught in a downpour was a customer with no alternative. Now here comes this merchant with a contraption that lets a person shelter himself, for free, forever, without hiring anybody. Hanway was not carrying an umbrella. He was carrying the end of their business model, in public, where other men could see how easy it looked. So they went after him. They bespattered umbrella carriers with mud and lashed at them with their whips. On one occasion, a coachman reportedly tried to run Hanway down with his vehicle, and Hanway, who was not a large man and not a young one, responded by giving the driver a thorough thrashing with the umbrella itself. And he did not stop. He kept walking London in the rain under that thing for about 30 years, through the jeers of passengers and the clamour of the chairman, until he died in 1786. By then, he had watched the practice become normal. By then, Londoners had started calling the object a Hanway, which is a spectacular and slightly absurd form of immortality. Do a thing stubbornly enough, and your surname becomes the noun. Now, here is where the story most people tell you falls apart. Jonas Hanway was not the first person in London with an umbrella. Not close. Women in the city had apparently been carrying them since around 1705. John Gay published a poem in 1716 with housewives sheltering under an oily canopy while they walked on clinking pattens through the wet, which is nearly 40 years before Hanway supposedly invented the whole idea. Some English churches kept a communal umbrella hanging in the porch, and in one town, the clergyman's umbrella was hung up every Sunday for the congregation to admire on the way in, like a small technological exhibit. So Hanway did not introduce the umbrella. The umbrella was already there, in the hands of women, in the porches of churches, in a published poem. What Hanway actually broke was the rule from Greece and Rome, the one that said a man under a canopy was a man to be laughed at. And the reason breaking it took 30 years of abuse is that a taboo is never just a taboo. Somebody is always earning a living from it. The coachman understood perfectly well what a dry pedestrian meant for the fare box. He was not alone in the trenches either. About 20 years later, a footman named John MacDonald started carrying a silk umbrella he had brought back from Spain, and boys followed him down the street, shouting the sharpest insult they had, which was, "Frenchman, why don't you get a coach?" He gripped the handle and kept walking. Within roughly 3 months, nobody bothered shouting anymore. That is how fast a 4,000-year-old rule can die once somebody refuses to be embarrassed. If this is pulling you in, the subscribe button keeps stories like this one coming, and you will want to stay for what happens next, because the moment that finally destroyed the umbrella's power did not come from a philanthropist or a king. It came from a wire drawer with a warehouse problem. His name was Samuel Fox, born in 1815 in Bradwell, Derbyshire, the youngest son of a shuttle weaver. At 16, he was apprenticed as a wire drawer, and he grew into a master of it, which sounds like the least glamorous skill available in the 19th century, and turns out to be the hinge of this entire story. By around 1848, Fox's works at Stocksbridge, near Sheffield, were making steel ribs for umbrella frames. In 1852, he introduced the frame that changed the object forever, the Paragon, built from steel rolled into a U-shaped section. That sounds like a footnote. It is not. Before Fox, umbrella ribs were straight and hinged, made from wood or iron or whalebone, sitting on a handle that could be an inch thick. After Fox, the ribs were light, springy, curved and cheap, and they gave the umbrella the silhouette you would draw if somebody asked you to draw an umbrella right now. Steel cut the weight so far down that carrying one stopped being a commitment and started being an afterthought. There is a story attached, and it is worth telling with the label on. It is said that Fox came up with the U-shaped rib as a way to use up surplus steel stays left over from women's corsets. The tale gets repeated everywhere, and it may well be true, but it lives in the said to have column, not in the record. What is documented is almost better. From 1855, Fox took a very similar product and made a fortune supplying the steel cages that held up crinoline hoop skirts. The same little strips of rolled steel were holding up the sky over your head and the shape of a woman's dress, and the company they built went on to become one of the great steelworks in Britain, running Bessemer converters and rolling railway track. After that, the object gets away from everybody. Fast. James Smith & Sons had opened a London umbrella shop in 1830, and it is still selling them today. Hans Haupt built a pocket umbrella in 1928. And in 1969, Bradford E. Phillips, the owner of Totes Incorporated of Loveland, Ohio, obtained a patent for what the paperwork magnificently calls a working folding umbrella, which quietly implies what everybody who owned the other kind already knew. So look at where the value ended up. An object that once required a servant to carry it now folds down to fit in a coat pocket. Americans buy something like 33 million umbrellas a year, worth roughly $348 million, according to figures from around 2008. As of that same period, the United States Patent Office was sitting on about 3,000 active patents for umbrella-related inventions, which means thousands of people have looked at a solved 4,000-year-old problem and thought, there must be more, and the manufacturing went home. Most umbrellas in the world are now made in China, where a single city, Shangyu, has been reported to hold more than 1,000 umbrella factories. The place that invented the waterproof canopy 2,000 years ago is currently making the disposable version for everyone else on the planet, which produces one last, very dark proof of how completely the thing lost its status. On the 7th of September 1978, a Bulgarian writer named Georgy Markov was waiting for a bus on Waterloo Bridge in London. Markov had defected in 1969 and spent years broadcasting criticism of the regime back home through the BBC and Radio Free Europe, and he had already survived 2 attempts on his life. He felt a sharp sting in the back of his right thigh, like an insect bite. He turned and saw a man bending down to pick up a dropped umbrella. The man apologized in a foreign accent and left. That evening, Markov came down with a fever, and 4 days later, on the 11th of September, he was dead at 49. The autopsy found a pellet the size of a pinhead embedded in his flesh, machined from platinum and iridium, drilled with 2 tiny holes forming a cavity, with traces of ricin inside. The poison had been sealed in with a substance designed to melt at body temperature. There is no antidote. 10 days earlier, another Bulgarian defector, Vladimir Kostov, had been struck the same way in the Paris metro and survived. The coroner's inquest in January 1979 ruled that Markov had been poisoned. The weapon itself was never recovered, so the umbrella remains the account of the man who died and the men who investigated it, rather than a thing in an evidence locker. But think about why that weapon was chosen at all. An assassin needed an object he could hold at arm's length on a crowded bridge in a European capital, in front of witnesses, and have not one single person turn their head. 4,000 years earlier, the same object announced a god. By 1978, it had become so ordinary, so beneath notice, that it could be used to kill a man in public, and the public would not even look up. So here is the answer to the question in the word. The umbrella was never really invented. It was demoted. It spent 4 millennia as a piece of political equipment, a portable throne room, a thing carried by a slave to prove that the person underneath was not like you. It survived the fall of Rome by hiding in China. It survived 1,000 years of European contempt by hiding in the hands of women who were carrying it in London a half-century before the man who supposedly discovered it. It took a merchant absorbing 30 years of thrown garbage and a wire drawer in Sheffield who found a cheaper way to bend steel to finally strip it of everything it used to mean. And that stripping is not a sad ending. That is the victory. The umbrella got everything it ever promised: shade, dryness, dignity in bad weather, and then it handed all of it to everybody, and the price of handing it to everybody was that nobody would ever be impressed by it again, which is worth sitting with, because it is not really about umbrellas. A society does not show you what it values by what it puts on display. It shows you what it has truly conquered by what it stops noticing. Clean water in a tap, a light switch, a canopy on a stick. The things we have actually won are the things we are bored by, and being bored by them is the whole reward. And 4,000 years ago, standing in a private patch of shade meant you were a king or a god, or close enough that people would kneel. Tonight, you will leave one dripping in a stairwell, and you will not think about it again, and you will not be wrong to. But the next time the sky opens up and you put your hand on that plastic handle and push it open without a thought, remember what the word still says. Umbra, shade. You are carrying a pharaoh's shadow, and it cost you $7, and it is yours. Quick one for the comments before you go. How many umbrellas would you guess you have lost in your life? Nobody keeps count, and that is exactly the point of everything you just heard. So throw a number down there and see how you stack up against everyone else who came through here today. Stay curious out there and keep looking twice at the ordinary things.